Frasier is one of my favorite shows of all time. It's one of the funniest shows ever crafted. Every single character is perfect and there's not a bad episode in it. When they announced the Frasier revival, many fans were skeptical, and that anxiety was not helped by the announcement that none of the main cast would be returning except for Kelsey Grammer as the titular character. But I was optimistic. After all, people weren't sold on the idea of a Frasier spin-off after Cheers anyway, and then Frasier ended up becoming probably the best spin-off ever. Sorry, Better Call Saul fans. The news eventually came out that it would only be a 10-episode season. This also made me worried. While this is not uncommon in the streaming age, for a show like Frasier, I felt like they would need way more, especially since we would have to get to know 4 brand new characters, and another character who we had only seen as a child. And adding on to that, Frasier was in a new home, so we would have to spend some time establishing that as well. It felt like a lot to do in a short period of time. Eventually, the first trailer came out, and as soon as I saw Kelsey Grammer's classic smile, none of those worries mattered. This show would be a must watch. So, was it actually good? Let's find out. Immediately when Frasier walks in, it looks different. The lighting, the blocking, the set design, the costumes. It doesn't feel like Frasier. I know it's been 20 years since Frasier ended, but even in the transition between Cheers and Frasier, you could still tell it was made by the same team and with the same care. Now I know not everyone on the creative team could come back, but there was enough of them there that this should have looked better. As a premiere for a revival goes, this episode is pretty run of the mill. Explain what happened since we last saw him, check. Explain what he is now doing, check. And give us 1 or 2 throwaway lines about our favorite characters who didn't make the trip, check. In this episode, we meet all the new characters actually: David, Eve, Olivia, and Alan, and we find out that Frasier's son, Freddie, who we last saw at his goth phase, had dropped out of Harvard to become a firefighter. And now there is tension between them because of that. Not made better by the fact that Freddie didn't show up for his grandfather Marty's funeral. And when you hear about this setup, it reminds you a little bit about another pilot episode, The Good Son. And obviously, it's not like they're trying to hide it, literally named this episode after it, but the episode goes pretty much exactly how you would predict it. They meet, and it's awkward, they fight, they make up, and find the real reason behind the tension. I do like that they throw a few curveballs. From all the trailers, it seemed like Eve and Freddie are a couple, and this episode starts like that, but quickly she refutes that, and then it seems like maybe Freddie is gay, and then it turns out maybe Freddie is a dad, but then it turns out he's not, she's just a roommate. I like that it kept us guessing. By the end of the episode, it is revealed that Freddie's firefighter friend and the father of Eve's son had died, and that Marty came to see Freddie before he died, helping Freddie through something that he can relate to. Overall, I think this episode was as good as it needs to be. Nothing special, but nothing terrible either. The final thing we see in this episode is a beautiful tribute to John Mahoney. Right off the bat, it's clear they are going for a parallel between Freddie and Martin. Both working class guys stuck in Frasier's upper class world, whereas in the original, they each had someone on their level to complement them. Frasier had Niles and Martin had Daphne, making it an interesting 2v2. But in the new show, Frasier has upper class friends, yes, and Freddie has working class friends, yes, but they feel more like props when they are involved with the Frasier v Freddie storylines. As far as the arc of their relationship goes, it ended up being better than I thought it would turn out by the time the finale rolls around. Feels good enough. A lot of people had a problem with the fact that they recasted Freddie. The original actor, Trevor Einhorn, is still a working actor today, but they decided to go with a more stereotypical looking jock type of casting, Jack Cutmore Scott. Now, Jack isn't a bad actor by any means, but something about his line delivery just feels off, almost like he knows he's a character in a TV show. It got better as the show went along, but in the first batch of episodes it was very, very distracting. Freddie is also very snarky and sarcastic toward Frasier in his high society world, again, much like how Martin was. But with Martin, it rarely got to the point where it seemed like he was disappointed in Frasier and Niles. It was more like Martin was disappointed in himself for not being able to understand his sons and connect with them. For Freddy, it honestly feels like there's actual hatred for his father at some points. And for Frasier fans, that is hard to watch. There was massive potential for the new version of Freddy, but instead of tapping into that potential, they chose to make a cheap copy of Martin without any of the charm or wit. In the second episode, we see Freddy moving into Frasier's newly purchased apartment. Another parallel to Marty, and of course, tensions arise. Freddy puts a piece of Red Sox memorabilia in full view, and Frasier gets insecure. Obviously, this is again a parallel to Marty with his famous chair. They really are not subtle with it, are they? But there is a fundamental difference between Freddy's dirt and Martin's chair. Number one, we never see the dirt ever again. In fact, when you take a look at his apartment, you would not be able to tell that his son lives there. But when you look at Frasier's Seattle apartment, one thing that sticks out like a sore thumb is Marty's chair. Why would they go through this whole episode about Frasier and Freddy fighting over one block of dirt to literally throw it out at the end? It makes no sense narratively. Oh sure, I guess Frasier learned some sort of lesson that he has to share his living space, but didn't he learn this by living with his dad for 11 years? I know people make the argument that this is different characters, so it's two different situations, but this is just ignoring an 11-year character arc. That's just plain dumb. Surely, if Frasier had lived with his dad in that chair for 11 years, one little Red Sox souvenir wouldn't be that bad, right? This is the worst rated episode. And this one, Frasier struggles connecting with his class, which makes sense because he has never taught before. But also in this episode, Eve is practicing acting, and Frasier ends up recruiting her to help him convince his class that he's a good teacher. Yeah, it's pretty dumb. Anyway, Frasier gets insecure because he spent the last 14 years as a daytime talk show host, which slowly became basically Ellen, but 100 times worse. And the stuff about Eve trying to improve her acting is just boring, honestly. The jokes are bad, and it just doesn't feel real at all. One problem in this episode that's in the whole show overall, but very noticeable here, is the laugh track. It's just so fake, and the way they play it just doesn't work. I know in the last decade, laugh tracks has become a rarity and people love to hate on them. But the truth is, a real laugh track is great. In the original Frasier, it was used very well. When laugh tracks are used from a live studio audience, you feel like you are there. And I know that they filmed this new show in front of a live studio audience, but they clearly hammed it up. And in those classic sitcoms like Cheers or Frasier, after they told the joke, the characters didn't just stand around and wait to speak, they actually laughed along or continued to do what they were doing, again, making you feel like you were actually there. Shows like the new Frasier is what caused laugh tracks to have such a bad name nowadays. In the trailers, it looked like Eve would be Freddy's girlfriend. But as I said, by the end of episode 1, she just ends up being a friend of Freddy's. Eve is the weakest of the new characters in my opinion. But in the beginning, she had the most potential out of all the new characters. She had something that no other character in the history of Frasier had. She was a true outsider. You might be saying, oh, Daphne or Roz were outsiders, but not really. Daphne was at first, but very quickly living with the Cranes made her become one. And as for Roz, working in radio for so long alongside Frasier made her almost as arrogant as Frasier or Niles. Eve had no connection to Frasier at all. Not in class, not in careers, not in family. She was a character who the writers could easily use to challenge Frasier in anything that he stands for. But as you could guess, the writers did not use her like that at all. She ended up just being sort of a straight man who maybe would crack one joke during the episode, rarely ever having anything to do in the story. As I said, wasted potential. I do think that they made improvements in the final few episodes that points to a better character that we will hopefully see in the upcoming season 2. After Freddy and his firefighter friends beat Frasier, Alan, and Olivia at trivia, Frasier starts to question the intelligence of firefighters. To prove that firefighters aren't dumb and are actually have a really hard job, Freddy invites Frasier to spend the night at the firehouse. But it turns out it's not a very busy night, and Freddy gets embarrassed. Eventually, Frasier understands that Freddy does have a hard job, and that he helps people by doing it. This episode is one of the worst in my opinion. There are only two things that I like in this episode. One is the mini subplot that David is confused as an orphan, and number two is the little jokes about Eddie. But other than that, everything about this episode is boring. Another issue in this season as a whole, but particularly in this episode, is the length. This episode is 27 minutes long, which is about 5 minutes longer than the average classic Frasier episode. This is common in the streaming age, now that showrunners don't have a 30-minute time slots with commercials breaks that they have to fit a show into, they can make their episodes as long as they want. In some cases this is good, but I think this actually hurts this show. If they would be forced to trim off all the fat and leave just the good stuff in, this episode would have been way better. I've seen David get a lot of hate online. Mostly people saying he's a cheap knockoff version of Niles and it just annoys them when he's on screen. This is the opposite for me. I honestly found David to be one of the most enjoyable out of the new characters. He was definitely there to be the clown of the show, but it was effective for the most part. He usually delivered the best laugh of the episode. He also works off most of the other characters very well. I really like the dynamic between him and his cousin Freddy. But David does have his flaws like any character. At first, he is a very one-dimensional character, that being the clown, like I said. But he definitely evolved as the show went on. It is interesting to see how the writers pulled from both Daphne and Niles to craft his character. He is their son after all. So he should take the best from both. Unfortunately, they leaned into the Niles side way too much in my opinion. Clearly, he's the one character they wish they could have brought over from the classic series. These few gripes aside, I still think David is an overall strong character, even in his limited screen time. And I definitely think that we will get to see more layers of him in Season 2. But the best thing about David is that he's just plain funny. I find most of the jokes delivered by these new characters to be pretty cringy, but David is just a classic funny guy. That's always nice to have in a sitcom. This is another episode that just drags on. It starts out as a story about Frasier, Olivia, and Alan wanting to get into an exclusive club at Harvard. It eventually turns into a deep discussion of Frasier and Alan's friendship. It's just a weird shift. We go from a classic Frasier party antics type of episode to an episode about just the two characters in a room talking about their issues. And it does drag on. This episode is just shy of 29 minutes long. The B plot is about Freddy and Eve teaching David how to talk to women. It's funny enough. I think Eve and Freddy are my least favorite team up of the characters, but luckily David is there to still keep it funny at least. But by the end it actually works and David picks up a girl. We see her once or twice after this episode, but I wouldn't be shocked if the writers ditch her for a new love interest in Season 2. This episode isn't the worst per se, it's just a bit boring. There is funny moments, David flirting like I mentioned, but I also like when Alan and Frasier were buttering up the waiter because they thought he was the dean. That was very funny. This episode was another victim of just too long of a runtime, but it's also a victim of just trying to fit too much into one episode. I find Alan to be an interesting character. He has great moments, but other times he has bad moments. He doesn't deliver consistent laughs like David does, but when Alan makes a good joke, it's one that you will remember. He's a character with many flaws, but also many strengths. He's lazy, but at times he can be loyal. Whenever Frasier needs solid advice, Alan is there to help him. Some people might get annoyed by his constant jokes about drinking, but I don't mind them. After all, Frasier started from Cheers, a show literally set in a bar, so I have nothing wrong with the drinking jokes. He also has the best physical comedy, with stuff like the gauntlet getting stuck to his hand and his white suit. These are things that I don't think any other character in the show could easily pull off in a funny way. I do hope we get to see more dimensions of Alan in Season 2. From what I've read, it seems like the first episode of the new season will be a pretty important one for him. But overall, Alan is a solid character who can pair up easily with the rest of the cast. This is one of the highest rated episodes, and a big reason for that is the runtime, coming in at a tight 23 minutes. It also has the feel of a classic Frasier episode. Eve sets both Freddie and Frasier up on blind dates, but when one of the dates arrives early, they don't know who she is for. Hijinks ensues. But when the other one shows up, they blow it up and neither of them get dates. I think this is the best use of the Freddie-Frasier pairing from a comedic view. They obviously had better moments later on and in the first episode, but those are more emotional type of moments. But this is a pretty funny episode and they do very well together. There isn't really a B plot, so we just focus on the Freddie and Frasier story, and that's actually a good thing in this case. I don't really have anything negative to say about this episode. David doesn't appear in this episode, which is kind of weird considering this is only a 10 episode season, so we already have limited time to get to know these characters, but if he was in this and they made a bigger B plot, it probably would have ruined this episode. This definitely feels like what modern Frasier should be, incorporating his classic type of adventures but mixing it with modern day ideas. My favorite of the season so far. Another good episode. This one is obviously highlighted by the fact that we see Bebe Neuwirth returning as Lilith Sternin, Frasier's ex-wife and Freddie's mother. They have always been competitive, and during Freddie's birthday party, they get competitive over who's closer with him. Frasier gets upset that she seems to know more about him and his friends than Frasier, but Lilith gets upset when she finds out Freddie and Frasier are living together. Eventually, they both come to an understanding that there is a place for both of them in the life of their son. This episode brings you back to the classic Cheers and Frasier episodes with Lilith and Frasier. They have always been a great pair together, but it also shines with Alan and David having very funny moments during the birthday party. One question you might be asking is, if Lilith works so good, why don't the writers make her a regular? That would be a bad idea in my opinion. Lilith wasn't even a regular on the original Frasier. She was in Cheers, but that was a much larger cast. Lilith works best in small doses. So I would like to see her return, but not for more than a handful of episodes. But even then, they have got to make sure it doesn't become a crutch that they lean on when they need a good episode. This episode is not as good as the last two, but it was still one of the better episodes of the season. It deals with Frasier getting Olivia to help him obtain professorship at Harvard, and through classic Frasier mistakes, he accidentally looks like a raging alcoholic and doesn't obtain the title. This is an okay story that had some funny moments. It's one of Olivia's better uses in the show too, in my opinion. But where this episode shines is, funnily enough, in the B plot. It's about David getting a B grade and using Freddie to help him get a better one. But in the end, he doesn't get it. And he and Freddie have a deep conversation about being Crane men. It's in their blood to always try to be the best, to obtain the unobtainable. This even ties into the Frasier plot about chasing the professorship title. And if you watch the classic Frasier and even Cheers, you know that Frasier Crane very much fits what David is saying. This episode ends up being a nice study of the so-called Crane condition. It's definitely not the funniest episode in the season, but it definitely makes you think. If you are a huge Frasier fan, then I think this episode will have an impact on you. Olivia is a very weak character, and worse than that, she's an inconsistent character. It really feels like the writers don't know what to do with her most of the time. Sometimes they try and make her a normal boss, other times she's a goofball Michael Scott type of boss. And other than being the boss, she only really has two other character traits. One, she is competitive, especially with her sister, and two, she has a crush on Freddie. But even the crush thing they ditched after like 3 episodes. I can't really say she has potential like I did with some of the other characters. I honestly don't know how they can improve this character. I did read that one of the season 2 episodes will be about her sister coming to town, so maybe that can have some sort of impact on where the writers take her. But overall, she's probably the most unimportant character of the show. However, I would love to be proved wrong. Another solid episode. Here we see Frasier try to let Freddy help out around the apartment more, but when he realizes it might take Freddy way too much time, he calls a plumber to find the source of the problem. Freddy sees this and gets upset, and then both of them realize that they have problems. Freddy is a sore winner, and Frasier realizes he still feels guilt about missing out on some of his son's childhood. It is a bit weird that Frasier's issue is way bigger than Freddy's. Like, Frasier genuinely feels like he has messed up as a father, and Freddy's problem is that he's just being a jerk. I wish they would have made it tie in together more. Like, maybe Freddy feels he needs to prove himself or something because of Frasier missing out on his childhood. It just feels like their arcs in this episode are a bit disconnected. There is a small B plot. David becomes Alan's assistant. Alan, of course, makes him a slave. It's funny enough, doesn't do anything spectacular, but it's good. For me, one of the funniest moments of the whole season came in this episode when Freddy catches the plumber so he pretends to be a professor that works with Frasier. All three actors did a very good job and I really enjoyed it. Overall, this is a good episode. The final episode of Season 1 is a Christmas episode. It's also the longest, clocking in at 30 minutes flat. I don't feel like the runtime hurt this episode like it did with a few of the other episodes. What hurts this episode is that it just feels empty. Let me explain why. The story of this episode is that Frasier is throwing a Christmas party, and because he is Frasier, of course, he messes it up. Everyone ends up going across the hall to Eve's place for a better party. This obviously makes Frasier upset. He's especially mad at his son Freddy because he believes that Freddy abandoned him, when in reality, Freddy was doing his best to help both Eve and Frasier during their first Christmas without a loved one, Eve's boyfriend and Frasier's dad, not realizing that he also lost those two people. It's a very interesting premise, but it feels like they don't say anything with it. They just give Freddy one line at the end saying he's okay and move on. It feels like they're just going through the motions. Another part of this episode that feels empty is the return of Peri Gilpin as Roz. Not saying I didn't love seeing her again, I definitely did, but she only shows up with 5 minutes left, she gives Frasier some advice, and then that's about it. This is also the highest rated episode online, and I can see why people love it. But for me, it just feels like they were shooting high and missed the mark. Apparently, Roz will be coming back in Season 2, so I hope they can do a better job with her than they did in this episode. I'm not going to talk about if I think Frasier needed a revival series. I'll save that for later. Right now, I just want to talk about the man himself and what this new season has done for him. We have always known Frasier had a strange relationship with his son. In all of 11 seasons of the original Frasier, we only saw his son about 10 times, so there was a big opportunity to make very good stories exploring their relationship. And I think that Frasier did take strides in becoming a better father this season. But I'm struggling to see how long they can stretch this out for. In the original Frasier, it got to a point where it was less about Frasier's relationship with his dad, it became more about Frasier's personal issues, like having trouble with finding the right woman. I don't want to see Frasier go through the same exact arc again. How do I know it will mean anything if the last time meant nothing? Frasier also just looks different too. Obviously, Kelsey Grammer is older, there's nothing wrong with that. But just look at how he dresses in this show. Flannels, jeans, sneakers. That's not Frasier. You can defend it by saying he's trying to dress more comfortably in an older age, but it still feels completely out of place. Sometimes it feels like the writers of this new show just don't understand Frasier fundamentally. At the end of the day, I am happy to see Frasier back for more adventures, but there must be improvements on his writing in Season 2. So in this last section, I just want to talk about my final thoughts on the season as a whole and where I think it can go from there. So I started writing this video when the first season ended back in December, but then I stopped about halfway through and I just never finished it. But then when the new trailer for Season 2 came out a few weeks ago, I figured I might as well finish the video. So I rewatched the entire series and finished the video, but it did feel good on a rewatch. The show definitely feels better when you watch them all at once, and You get a better perspective on the series as a whole and where it can fit into Frasier's life. I think it definitely helps. Um, Now the big question is, did we need a Frasier revival? And I honestly think we probably didn't. But you know what? We got one anyway, so let's hope we can make the best of it. And how can they do that? Well, here's a few things I think they need to do for season 2. Number 1, they have to bring Frasier back to Cheers. He's in Boston, and he hasn't gone to Cheers yet, and it was such a major part of his life. Now, I know they probably don't want to dwell on the past, but come on, they've brought back Roz and Baby Newirth. They're bringing back more characters already in season 2. Clearly, they do like to dwell on the past, so just bring him back to Cheers. Just make it one episode, maybe bring back one or two of the old actors. That's all you need to do. It will make lots of fans happy, especially me. And also, you need to develop Freddy and the other characters, but Freddy especially, as their own characters independent to Frasier. That's a major problem that most of them have, especially Freddy. And that's not too hard to do. They did that eventually with Niles and Martin and Daphne and Roz in the original series. So I think they can do it again. But yeah, overall it was better on the rewatch, but it is a complicated show. Good and bad moments, but I'm excited for season 2. Thank you for watching, everybody.